everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything going on in the world of Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we are talking about the Barcelona Grand Prix. As with last week, I am traveling, which means our setup might sound a little bit different and we might look a little different on YouTube, and that's because I was actually at the Barcelona Grand Prix. If you follow me on social media, you probably saw me preparing for the race, and you may have also seen that I was coming with my best friend whose birthday it was on race day. And I have to be honest with you, if you ever have a chance to know someone who has a birthday on race day, have your own birthday on race day, there is something very special about being at the track during a race on your birthday. We had such an incredible weekend because we made an effort to actually travel and see the city as well as go to the race, which I think sometimes gets a little lost in content and a little lost in the idea of why you should travel to a race and what you can do when you go. Formula One uniquely goes to some of the nicest destinations that you could go for travel, and you should try to take some time to explore the cities that you're in, that you're being hosted in, get a chance to see some of the culture, experience some of the local stuff. I highly recommend doing that if you can. I will spend most of the episode talking about the race itself because there was quite a lot to talk about this weekend, and you can also always see the race experience stuff as my daily vlogs come out on YouTube, on TikTok, on Instagram. Those are always at Marissa Kamari, as they always have been, and I'll also probably put together a longer form YouTube video talking about the track, the experience, and different ways that you can kind of experience Barcelona, though this is possibly one of the last races at this track. Next year, the Spanish Grand Prix moves to Madrid, which will be a city track and will be a very different experience than the Barcelona track has been. I will say that overall, I really enjoyed the experience of going to this track. The track as a whole actually felt a little bit more manageable than others. We were able to get to our seats pretty easily. We were able to kind of go through the crowds. And one of the reasons why I think that might be the case is that outside of hospitality zones at the Barcelona track, you actually cannot buy alcohol. They have 0.0 Heineken there the entire time, which I actually did see a number of people purchasing throughout the weekend, but there was nobody really blitz drunk or out of control. And I think a lot of that is because of the fact that they literally could not buy alcohol at the track. It also saves you a lot of money if you typically do buy alcohol at the track, and it just kind of made the experience, I think, a little bit more enjoyable because it is really well managed. I never really found that we got into a situation with the crowds where I felt unsafe or that I felt like there might be something going on, or even really just irritated by other people. The crowd in general was really well managed. We had a really good time, and also we sat in the Carlos Sainz grandstand, which I guess, it made sense when we booked our tickets, but with the way that the race ended up turning out, it wasn't necessarily the best version of what could have happened. But I will say it was a really good deal. Our tickets were about €300 for the entire weekend, and with that, you not only got a grandstand seat and access to the track the entire weekend, but you also got a Carlos Sainz hat and a Carlos Sainz banner, which was really fun because on Saturday we all got the hat, and on Sunday we all got this banner, which meant that the entire time on Sunday, every time Carlos went by or when we had the driver parade, everyone was waving this flag, and it was a huge takeover, and I'm pretty sure it made it onto the broadcast. So I really found it to be a really cool experience to be surrounded by Carlos Sainz fans in his home country, and also there were quite a few Fernando fans in that same grandstand. So for me, I don't know if they'll do this in Madrid or if it'll be a different vibe, but if you do attend the Spanish Grand Prix and you have the opportunity to sit in one of the drivers' grandstands, assuming that you enjoy that driver and that you're not going to be there and be a horrible person to other fans, I think it's a really nice option, not only on terms of cost, but also in terms of placement on the track. The view was incredible, and in terms of the actual experience of being surrounded by fans. I don't think there was a single seat left in our grandstand, so I really enjoy a kind of packed, full fan experience when I go to a race, and that's exactly what we got sitting there. So all that being said, let's dive into the race weekend itself. Heading into this race weekend, we were coming off of a Lando Norris win in Monaco. We're at the very end of a very kind of brutal triple header, and we were starting to see a three-way championship battle emerge. Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris were only a couple of points apart going into this race, and Max Verstappen was creeping up behind him. Also heading into this race, we'd had pretty poor performance from Ferrari, and we were seeing up until last week pretty good performance from Mercedes. And then we got into this race weekend. What was interesting to see across the free practice sessions and when we got into qualifying was that we were really seeing a number of cars that haven't been performing well. We were seeing the McLarens that we were expecting to perform well continue to perform well, and going into this race there was a large conversation about the fact that McLaren would have to change their front wing. This idea that McLaren has been cheating or gaining an unfair advantage from a flexi wing was combated by new regulations that went into effect this weekend. But we pretty much saw that those changes did not change anything about McLaren's performance. And to be honest, it was one of the moments that we saw pretty dry and specific humor from Oscar this weekend when he was asked about it. They asked about how he thought their performance would be affected if he was upset about the flexi wing situation, and he basically said the most disappointing thing about it is going to be the fact that everyone's expecting it to make a big difference, and it really won't. Which, again, it really didn't. We saw very incredible performance from the McLaren, as we have been for a very long time, and that flexi wing change did not make a big difference to their performance. Which, again, I think is, if you're new to this sport, something that continually happens. We see this idea where teams are like, oh, this team is cheating because of this really specific thing thing that we saw, and then we see the FIA take action on that thing, and then we don't really see that they were actually cheating. We just see that they were kind of engineering and doing what they wanted. This is a long-term thing. It's not just about this season. It's not just about McLaren dominance. Very typically, you will see these battles happen when one team is starting to be very dominant and teams that used to be really dominant are upset. Everyone's trying to figure out what it is that the other team is doing that's making their car perform so much better than everyone else. And as they kind of poke through, point, prod, and kind of find that answer, they're also hoping that that answer is something that is technically illegal so that they can move on and kind of get that banned. Anyone would love a silver bullet that basically says, oh yeah, your competitor this entire time, they've been blowing you out of the water, but they've only been doing that because they weren't following the rules and now they have to. It turns out that the flexi wing was not that silver bullet. And we did see a big deal made out of this whole situation for it ultimately not to make a big difference. So that being said, we then move into the actual kind of race weekend with qualifying. Qualifying has a couple of really big moments. First, devastatingly for me and also for this whole Red Bull saga, Yuki Tsunoda gets knocked out in Q1 and qualifies dead last. And our other Q1 exits were not necessarily the ones that we expected. We have Carlos Sainz knocked out, qualifying P18 at his home race. And then your other Q1 exits were not shocking. They were Esteban Ocon and Nico Hülkenberg. However, it is important to note that Nico Hülkenberg qualified P16, and we'll get into why when we talk about the race itself. Q2 exits, we see the other Williams, Alex Albon, actually exit at P11. Gabriel Bortoleto has a suddenly pretty decent qualifying, which I thought was impressive. He came in P12, which has been better than he has been doing, and obviously outqualified his teammate. And then we have the matter of Lance Stroll. Lance qualifies P14 in this race, which means that he did in fact participate in qualifying and moved on. The problem here is that a little bit later, we find out that Lance will be withdrawing from the Spanish Grand Prix. And if you're not familiar with the sporting rules, because he competed in qualifying itself, Aston Martin could not put another driver in his car for the Grand Prix. The official statement was that Lance Stroll has been suffering extreme pain in his wrists, and that was due to the fact that he had that accident back in 2023 where he broke both of his wrists and then was in the car quite quickly afterwards. Now, this is kind of a mixed bag, because as someone who did play through injuries in high school, it can cause bigger issues if you don't allow yourself to fully heal before getting back into whatever you're doing. So for Lance, he breaks both of his wrists, then gets into a car and a sport that requires you, in fact, to use your wrists pretty intensely while you're driving a vehicle at high speeds. That means that those injuries are really not able to fully heal and rest, and it also means that he's continued to kind of put that stress on his wrists overall and on that injury, and that would continue to degrade your kind of performance, your ability, your body's ability to heal. And so it is reasonable to believe that he is having some sort of complication from that injury in 2023 and that he's continuing to feel it. However, the sort of complicated monkey wrench in this situation is that we did see some reporting from a reputable news source, the BBC, that Lance basically threw a temper tantrum in the garage after being knocked out in Q2. The report said that he was yelling and even throwing things in the garage, and when Aston Martin was asked for comment, they said Lance was upset. It's kind of difficult to know how those things are linked, right? Was he upset that he had been kind of racing through all of this pain and still can't perform in the way that he wants to? Did he feel that his car was not up to the same standards as Fernando's, as Fernando suddenly did do a lot better than he's been doing, and we saw him actually make it all the way to Q3 and qualify 10th? Did something happen that we're not privy to? All of those things are possibilities, but the other part that makes it a little difficult is if he felt fine to kind of throw things around the garage, how tough are his wrists really feeling? In general, I've never really felt that throwing things in a garage in that environment is a good thing, or that it's an acceptable way to behave regardless of the driver. My favorite driver could do it and I would still really not be okay with it. I am curious if his reaction really did have to do with pain and frustration, or if the withdrawal was about something else. I do think it's plausible that it's about this injury. I do think it's possible that after breaking both of your wrists and jumping right back into a sport that puts a lot of strain on those wrists, you could cause yourself pretty chronic pain from that injury and continue to have those issues throughout. I do think it's possible that he is still feeling the pain of that injury, but the reporting of that much of a kind of issue in the garage does make me curious if it was something else, because we also saw that this was the reason he missed weigh-in. After a qualifying session, the drivers have to be weighed and they have to kind of check in with the FIA, so to speak. Lance did not appear there, and it kind of seemed like it was most likely because of whatever issue he was experiencing in pain. But now we know that it's because he was throwing a fit in the garage, and so there would have been a sporting penalty applied to his qualifying. Had he not withdrawn from the race, he would have experienced a penalty from qualifying for not showing up for that check-in. And because of that, it makes the situation just a little more murky. I will say that I feel like not only have I defended Lance on this podcast, less than an hour before he withdrew from the Spanish Grand Prix, I was defending him at dinner. I think there are a couple of schools of thoughts on Lance Stroll. One, a lot of people feel like he doesn't deserve to be here. He's not talented enough. He's just here because his dad bought a team. For me, I think he had a decent enough junior career that it was a possibility he'd be considered for a Formula One seat. And of course, everybody has a monetary aspect that they bring to a team because that's how this sport works. There are certainly more than 20 people in the world capable of driving for Formula One. Every single guy on the grid right now has some sort of extra edge beyond just his talent that allows him to stay there. Lance's extra edge is in fact his dad's money, and the fact that his dad has been willing to buy teams in order for him to continue having that seat. But I don't think that that means that he shouldn't be allowed to have a seat. I think a lot of other drivers have a lot of monetary benefits that they bring to a team, and Lance's is just the most visible because his dad is actually involved in the ownership of the team. But there are plenty of other financially backed kind of seats in this sport that I think it's unfair to say that Lance's nepotism is any worse than any other situation on the grid. The second school of thought is this idea that he doesn't want to be there, that he wants to be doing something else, and that he has to be doing this because of that money being invested. And this is what we were talking about at dinner. We were going back and forth and kind of saying, well, do you think that it's that he doesn't actually like this sport? Because we've seen him enjoy it growing up, we've seen him kind of be passionate about it, and we have seen these moments where he seems to actually be really happy to be there. Or, which was what I was saying, is it just that he's receiving so much hate from this sport that it's hard to seem like you're having a good time, that you have to just sort of like block it all out and show up and try to do your job? And that was sort of the angle that I felt. It's hard to kind of deal with all of the kind of intense haters that you get and still want to kind of show up to work, right? Even if it's a job that seems like it's the greatest job in the world. Like, I am genuinely always jealous of these drivers, not for the money, for the fame, or anything like that, just for the fact that they get to drive these cars. I can't imagine what it would be like to like wake up every day and that's your job. Though of course it's still a job, and I'm sure there are still things that people want to complain about. And I do think that potentially if you have like literally the dream job, the best job that you could possibly have, that you've been working towards your whole life, and then you get there and you sort of become the punching bag of the internet, the punching bag of the other drivers, the punching bag of even reporters and different people like that. If you're constantly being told we don't think you belong here, then I think it's fair to kind of feel like I don't really want to kind of engage with that, and maybe I don't have like the best attitude. I think in general people should try to have a good attitude, and especially if you're trying to prove people wrong, it would be helpful to kind of do so. But I get the idea that he could potentially just not feel like the best when he's there. But then we have situations like this where we hear he's throwing stuff around in the garage. We see him skip his way in, which everyone knows you have to show up for it or you will have a penalty. It's one of those non-negotiables. And then we see him withdraw from the Grand Prix. So it's hard to really know what's going on here. Are we going to see Lance return? Are we going to see a new full-time driver in that seat? Is his injury very serious, and does he not have the ability to kind of return to this sport because it is a injury that he did not take care of in the first place? I don't know, there's a lot of factors here. One thing I think we can take away as non-professional athletes, definitely rehab your injuries and don't try to push yourself too hard. Because if it is just wrist pain, it actually really sucks. Because this was a weekend that we suddenly saw the Aston Martins performing very well. Next year, we're expecting Aston Martin to really show up in a different way with a new power engine supplier and Adrian Newey designing their car. And it seems like Lance may not be there for that. And if Lance's injury is pretty serious and it takes him out of the game, it sucks that his desire to prove that he could get back into the car as fast as possible and that he wanted to be there, so to speak, this big competitive nature, could be the thing that keeps him from experiencing a good run with Aston Martin. So across the board, it's a little tough, right? Does he actually have this injury? Is it something else? Why did he throw a fit in this extreme way? Why did he put himself in a bad situation by skipping weigh-in? And will we see him return this season? And if not, who will we see put into that seat for a long period of time? I think we'll kind of see the answer to that question in the next couple of weeks. We'll obviously need someone in the car for Canada. We have a break right now after this triple header. And I think the really big question will be what the update is on Lance after we see him go into whatever medical care he's going into this week. The really big thing for me is that if he genuinely was just experiencing extreme pain, I'm very curious as to why Aston Martin didn't make the decision to withdraw him before qualifying and put another driver in that car. For him to actually go through qualifying and then keep that car off the track for the weekend feels like a weird kind of choice from Aston Martin. If this was kind of chronic pain, if this was pain that he was experiencing, because he went through all 3 free practice sessions and they had to assume that he was actually in well enough state to continue the race. Otherwise, they would have replaced him before qualifying. So I do think that this saga has a kind of number of issues with it. The question will be, what's the truth behind it? Where does he end up? And when, if ever, will we see him return to that seat and get back on track? Plus, who do they have lined up? And not to get like too extrapolaty here, if we don't see Lance return to that seat, if we see him say like, oh, the pain is too much, or we need him to kind of move on, does that open up kind of silly season this year? Because that Aston Martin seat, despite being a midfield team right now, will be pretty coveted with those changes being made next year. So if Lance really is chronically injured and can't continue, I think we could see an interesting shakeup there with that seat becoming available. Okay, and then to round out qualifying, we obviously have Q3. A couple of big things from this. Isaac Hadjar continues to really impress. Isaac really is the most impressive rookie to me right now. In terms of driver placement, he has been in the most tumultuous situation. He was the last to be announced and kind of came in after a very big driver kind of debate about who was going to get that second Red Bull seat between Liam and Yuki. He's had 2 different teammates this year and he's had to deal with that. He came into Australia and then didn't even get to start the race going into the wall. He had this beautiful moment being comforted by Lewis Hamilton's dad, which is just like the epitome of what sports are. And then he has just been systematically knocking it out of the park. And we see him get all the way to Q3 again. And I think with the Red Bull situation, it's always interesting to compare all four drivers, which if you compare Isaac with everyone else, which remember, everybody else has a lot more experience than him, Isaac has been out qualifying his teammate regardless of which one it was. And when we look at the spread of Red Bull this weekend, he is in fact the only other Red Bull driver other than Max that made it to Q3. I think Isaac has really shown himself to be really special. I think a lot of people, myself included, were not really sure about him coming from F2 because he did have a little bit of an ego, a little bit of an attitude, but I think he's really settled into Formula One very, very well. And I think he's just going to continue to be our rookie to watch and potentially our rookie of the year, not to get kind of ahead of ourselves. We have a lot of the season left, but ultimately I think Isaac really has had an incredible story thus far, and he is sort of my biggest rookie to root for. Other big moments, we see Fernando Alonso make it all the way to Q3, qualifying P10, and if you were at the track, you know that it was a big deal. When he put in that time that we knew he was going to do well, he actually went around and did his wave to everybody, and obviously people continued to put in faster times after that, and he didn't really put up another time, but it was really cool because Fernando has not been performing well. We've talked about that a lot on this podcast. We've talked about this idea of sort of his legacy being tarnished, and I've also kind of wondered whether or not he feels like he's gone too far, whether he'll be able to end his career in a way that he's happy with. But I will say, watching the fans in person, people were really excited about Fernando. They stood, they clapped, they gave him a standing ovation every time he kind of went around the track, and during qualifying when he put up that time, people were really, really proud of him. Like, genuinely, you could feel not just happiness, but pride. And so it made a little bit more sense actually getting to experience it in person to maybe see a little bit more of who Fernando's driving for, if not just himself. Then we also see Pierre Gasly make it to 8th. And with Alpine and Pierre and this kind of second driver situation, it almost feels like we're seeing a midfield version of Red Bull. Pierre is so insanely outperforming his teammates that we then see one of them replaced very quickly in Jack, whether or not he was given enough time to really prove that he could do it or not do it. And then we see his replacement, Franco Colapinto, who has a lot of promise, really just not be able to deliver either. And so the question becomes, what is it that is keeping them from delivering? Because Pierre is performing. And so it's easier on a midfield team to say, oh, it's the car, when everybody's not doing well. But when we're seeing Pierre kind of pull out these suddenly surprising times, when we're seeing Pierre make it all the way to Q3, it's harder to argue that you should not be able to make it out of Q1. And I think it's going to be an interesting dynamic to see, like, do they decide to keep Franco in that seat? Do they put Jack back in the seat? What do they do for the rest of the season? And are they going to be happy with any of their options if nobody can seem to match Pierre's performance in this car? Then, in a really actually surprising performance, we see Ferrari split the Mercedes cars each way. George Russell qualifies 4th, Lewis Hamilton is right behind him in 5th, Kimi Antonelli is 6th, and Charles Leclerc is 7th. And Charles Leclerc specifically actually had them save tires for him. He wanted to save a set of tires for the race, and in his post-qualifying interviews, he said that it was his call and that he would take the heat if they had a bad race because of it. Obviously starting further back on the grid, but coming in with a better tire allocation than any of his competitors. And so this one I thought was an interesting risk, because there's a lot of conversation, as there always is with teammates, about this head-to-head competition between Lewis and Charles. And we saw Lewis really outpace him in qualifying. But then we hear that it's because Charles Leclerc decided to hold back a set of tires, which ultimately became very valuable for him in this race. And so this was an interesting move, because I think with Ferrari, we continue to see, not just this year, but last year and in previous seasons, that the drivers have to be the ones to make these really big strategy calls. And I think Charles is actually pretty used to it, and Lewis is really not. He's really used to having the same strategist that he's always had and making these decisions together. And so I do think that potentially Lewis needs to learn how to do that as well. Lewis needs to really force himself to make those decisions and make those calls, which we have seen him sometimes do. But Charles Leclerc is making these big swings, and this big swing really did pay off for him. Then, of course, lastly, we have this sort of head-to-head battle, really down to the wire for pole position between Oscar and Lando. And at the very last kind of head-to-head, we see Oscar take that pole and Lando just be right behind him. Max is there in 3rd, but even with that front wing change, we still see the McLarens absolutely dominating in pace and speed. So that runs us through qualifying. Let's get into the race itself. I want to take us through a couple of the big stories for me, the big storylines in this race. One of them starts with the opening of this race. Oscar gets away very clean and quickly, which then just puts him in open air, which seems to be the most dangerous place for a McLaren to be these days. But Max gets a really good start. We see him make a great move on Lando and take that 2nd position. Lando kind of slots behind him in 3rd, and then across the board, we see a lot of movement in these first couple of laps. Nico Hülkenberg is one of those people who really benefits from that movement, because in those first 2 laps, he makes up a ton of positions. We see him jumping ahead, and we see him really moving through the field, and Nico himself goes from qualifying P16 to finishing the race in 5th. And I think performances like this are always a good reminder that there are really good drivers in the mid and back of the field, but sometimes because of the way the sport works, we don't actually get to see their full potential, because they don't have the tools needed to show us that. Nico Hülkenberg is a great driver, and being able to make that kind of move, cut your way through the field in that way in a Sauber is pretty impressive. And for me, the biggest excitement actually in watching that was remembering that next year that team becomes Audi. And I'm very curious to see if we see that car become a better car, if we see the development there really change things, and if Nico Hülkenberg gets to become a player on this field again. Because moves like this really show you that there is that possibility. If Nico can cut his way through the field in that extreme way, there's something really exciting about that. And then the real name of the game here was managing pit stop strategies and kind of dealing with contact across the board. We see Alex Albon devastatingly have to retire after receiving contact, and it was tough to watch because he actually went in, got a new nose cone, came back out, obviously putting him at a pretty far back space. And then we see him get contact again, ultimately have to retire from the race, but because he was given a time penalty, he actually goes in, serves the penalty, comes back out for one more lap, and then retires the car. And then obviously we have a tough situation with Carlos Sainz as well. Pit stops were really early, it felt like, and it really just never seemed like he was going to have a chance to make up his kind of bad qualifying position. Frankly, a nightmare weekend for Williams after a really long, good run that they've been having. Hopefully we see them recover from this quickly, return to Canada after this small break, and kind of perform again. Because Williams has been one of my favorite stories on the grid to watch, and I was really hoping that we were going to see them get to be really competitive, that we would see Carlos have this great race weekend because it was his home race. But alas, that is not what we had at all. Unfortunately, we had maybe one of the worst weekends that they've had this season. No points, a retirement, kind of not the best tire strategy, or at least just competitively not, and really not much space gained. Alex doesn't finish the race, he does DNF. Carlos qualified P18 and ends P14, which sounds like he made up a bunch of positions, but we had 2 retirements, and we also had Lance Stroll not compete in the race at all, so there were only 19 cars in the field. Additionally, we saw Haas have a pretty rough race, both of them kind of bring up the rear overall, and again, Franco Colapinto really just does not perform. And for me, it was interesting to look at the back of the field, because last week we saw Esteban Ocon really kind of show up for Monaco. We saw him have an unexpectedly great race, and then we kind of see both of the Haas's just totally drop off. And then we have these 2 drivers that I think have a lot of focus on them in similar ways because of the people that they've replaced. Franco Colapinto and Yuki Tsunoda. Franco finishes this race 15th, which means that the only people behind him in the race at the end were the 2 Haas's, and Yuki makes it up to P13 from P20, but remember we lost 3 cars, which is still some places gained, but he's not able to make it up into the points. And I think we've already talked about kind of the Franco situation, but the Yuki situation was particularly devastating for me because I really like Yuki. I really would like to see him perform. And I think it's tough to watch. Like, I think this is similar to how Checo fans must have felt last year, where it seems almost inexplicable that things are going as badly as they are, where you see someone who you know can drive. Like, Yuki is a good driver. Checo was a good driver. Liam Lawson had really good potential. You see all 3 of these drivers just not only not perform at the best of their abilities, but somehow have their performance completely drop off the face of the earth, it feels like. There's this weird kind of situation where it feels like you get into this Red Bull second seat and maybe you perform well for a little bit or a race or 2, and then there's just this sudden drop off where like things just do not hold the way that we want to see them hold. And the Yuki situation was really tough to watch because I was hopeful that we could at least see him move through the field and make it to P10, and we just did not get there for him. And I think also the tougher part was watching Yuki continually get lapped. Watching Oscar and Lando get to the back of the field and need to pass him, and then watching Max also have to lap him. Because where we were sitting, you could really see it, and it was just tough to watch. It's tough to watch a driver that you think has a lot of performance and a lot of promise, and not be able to make it in a team that it feels like he should be able to. And again, this is not a unique experience to Yuki. This has happened to other drivers at Red Bull. And obviously Red Bull had a pretty tough weekend this weekend, but Yuki's pretty bad performance, I hope, was just a fluke, a bad weekend, and I hope we see a really big change again when we get to Canada. Maybe Canada will solve everyone's problems. And then we have the sort of dueling Ferraris. Throughout this race, it was interesting to watch Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, because for quite a bit we saw Lewis defending his position, but then ultimately it seems like he was asked by Ferrari to let Charles Leclerc through. And this is a kind of question I have for you or for me. I don't know how I feel about team orders when it comes to this type of thing, where I think ultimately, frankly, based on performance, Charles Leclerc would have passed Lewis on his own. And having sort of team orders, asking people to let each other through, sometimes I think it can be tough. I think we've seen that with McLaren last year. We talked about that with McLaren earlier this season. The idea of instituting team orders always can raise tensions, I think, a little bit. And especially if you don't necessarily need to institute them. Ultimately, things did work out for Charles Leclerc very well this race, and I am happy to have seen that performance. But I think that Charles Leclerc had the pace and the ability to pass Lewis on his own. And so there's this question of the fact that, like, it does not feel like the team relationship at Ferrari is doing very well. Not necessarily between the 2 drivers, but between the drivers and their engineers and where everyone's kind of settled. Things have been tense on the radio between both drivers and their engineers, and we're seeing the drivers actually intentionally have to make their own strategy calls. So does it feel like kind of making these team order calls gets in the way when it doesn't necessarily need to? Is there a place to allow these two drivers to sort of battle it out and actually pass on track? Is anyone ever really going to be happy if their teammate passes them, whether they're told to let them by or whether they're kind of passed on merit? I think it's a tough question. Obviously, your teammate is always going to be your biggest competition, and there are a lot of questions about what that makes you feel on track, but I was a little surprised by the call. In general, it does feel like Charles Leclerc had better pace. Watching him open that gap after he did pass Lewis was kind of clear, and ultimately we see Charles Leclerc have just this incredible end to his race, partially because of that tire call that he made in qualifying. And then we get into the very front of the race. For a period of time, I thought Max was going to win this race, actually, because we see him go on this kind of different tire strategy. He goes on a 3-stop strategy, which seemed pretty outlandish, to be honest, but we also saw him continually moving right back up the field after these pit stops. And one of the biggest kind of factors in this race were the lapped cars, because the McLarens at the front were moving at such a fast pace that we were seeing those gaps get closed only when they got into the traffic. And also that traffic at points did, for long stretches of time, keep those two McLarens in particular from racing each other. And through most of the race, we just saw Oscar in clean air and Lando really kind of trying to catch up but not being able to, and then Max really trying to hunt Lando down for a period of time and then kind of managing his own 3-stop strategy. And there was a period of time where it felt like Max actually could win the race. And I think that period of time was when he was not actually going in for that 3rd stop. The question was, could he have stayed out? And ultimately, had he, it would have been a better strategy given the fact that we ended up under safety car and everyone got a free pit stop. And also that free pit stop caused a lot of drama for him personally. And so let's talk about that. Kimi Antonelli goes off the track and it looks like it wasn't his fault. It was a mechanical issue. However, I will say in terms of like great seats at the Barcelona Grand Prix, Kimi went into the gravel right ahead of us. We literally saw him kind of careen off the track. Dust went everywhere, and then we also obviously watched the crane and the marshals kind of take that car out. If you want to see some of that footage, it'll be on my social media accounts for sure. But that safety car ends up giving us a really exciting race, because up until that point, it kind of felt like, okay, it's going to end exactly the way it started in terms of the podium. Oscar, Lando, Max. But then we get this safety car restart, which really changes things. Everybody goes in for a free pit stop. The order kind of stays the same, but Max ends up on hard tires. And his radio message made it clear that he had no idea that that's what was happening. And I do think that this is a question on strategy. Should he have stayed out on the tires that were used that he was already on, knowing that everybody around him would have fresher tires? Or should he have done what he did, which was get these new hard tires, which would give him fresh tires, but arguably the worst compound to start back up on, because you can't really get any of the warmth and the heat into those tires and they take the longest to open up. So starting on cold, hard tires from a safety car restart is just not a great move. But obviously the strategy team was worried about him not having fresh tires when everybody else on the grid would have had fresh tires. And you don't know necessarily what lap that safety car is going to end on, so you don't know how many laps you have to make yourself get through on non-fresh tires while everyone else has brand new ones. So obviously there is this sort of debate. Do we put him on these tires? Should we not? And neither answer is a good option, frankly. But we see Max go back out, and then we also see him suddenly realize, oh my god, I'm on hard tires. Why am I on hard tires? And he's told that that's all they had left. Now remember, Charles Leclerc made this big strategy decision during qualifying to keep an extra set of tires for himself. That strategy obviously ends up paying off for him. We get into that safety car restart, Max loses his position, and Charles Leclerc takes 3rd. And then we get into the tough situation here, which is that in that kind of swap, with Charles Leclerc making the move over, a gap is open that means that George Russell has an opportunity to overtake Max. And Max, trying to defend from that, goes into the exit lane. Here is where things get tough. If you're new to the world of Formula One, you may or may not know that you can't gain an advantage by leaving the track. And typically that's when you'll hear an engineer tell a driver to hand the position back to the driver that they just overtook or avoided being overtaken by. So if you see a driver leave the track and come out back in front of another driver, often you'll see the team tell them to hand that position back to avoid a penalty. Max was told to hand the position back to George, and he argued about whether or not he was going to do that, but while he was arguing on the radio, we saw him slow down and we saw George move, expecting to be given that position back, and then we see Max speed up and cause a collision with George. Now here's where things get tough. This was a bad move for Max. It was unsportsmanlike, and if it was intentional as it was ruled by the FIA to have been, it really makes no sense to me actually. I think Max generally understands the kind of consequences that would come from that, and intentionally hitting another driver, which I don't know that he was intentional like malicious, or if it was intentional like I'm not giving the position back and he has to move. Across the board, it just seemed like a really odd move, because he had to have been aware of what the penalty would have been. He had to have been aware aware of the fact that he is close to a race ban, and he had to be aware that it would have caused him to drop significantly in the points after an objectively well-raced race, and he sacrifices a podium in this moment. But the even tougher part about the whole situation is that the FIA releases their document about the incident, and the way that it's phrased either feels like the FIA is actively trying to cause drama in the house of Red Bull, or they're trying to make fun of them on a global platform. Because to my recent memory, I have not seen the FIA speculate about whether or not they would have made a call, and especially not in a parenthetical. But the way that this document is worded, we see them say that they would not have awarded a penalty to Max for overtaking off track. This is because where he did go off track is actually completely legal, and he would not have been penalized for gaining an advantage by leaving the track, meaning that the decision to actually tell him to give the position back, which then causes this sort of kerfuffle, for lack of a better word, was not the right call. Max did not need to hand that position back and would not have received a penalty had he not handed the position back. So had he not slowed down and then sped up, there would have been no penalty. He would have kept that position. He would have kept the points, and even if George had passed him later, there would have been no time penalty. So you basically find out that this whole drama that the FIA felt the need to confirm was completely not necessary. And it's tough because I think these are actually two separate issues. Max was completely legal in leaving the track and shouldn't have necessarily handed the position back or been told to, but he also absolutely shouldn't have drawn contact and hit George, whether that was intentional or not intentional, but especially if it was intentional. And it is this weird moment where we're seeing the FIA confirm, yeah, buddy, if you would have just stuck to your guns, everything would have been fine. And why they felt the need to actually state that is very interesting to me, because the tone was sassy. It's hard not to be sassy in a parenthetical aside, to be honest. And so I do wonder what this looks like for Max. Max now gains an additional 3 penalty points, which puts him 1 point away from a single race ban. The way penalty points work in F1 is that you keep them for a full 12-month cycle after they are awarded to you. So I believe Max has 2 more races that he needs to get through without receiving another penalty point, meaning that he needs to race pretty clean in Canada. But even when those 2 points fall off, he'll still have these 3 that he's just earned, and it still does kind of keep him in that danger zone. If you watch basketball, it's sort of like fouling out in that, except instead of it being every game, you actually don't reset those points until 12 months later. So this incident not only causes Max to drop down from 4th all the way down to 10th, meaning that he only receives a single point for this race, and that Red Bull also only receives a single point for this race. But it also puts him in this sort of danger zone where he has to start being a little bit more careful with the way that he drives. And obviously, post-race, we definitely see the return of the George Russell versus Max Verstappen beef. Max promises to bring his tissues, George cries about the children. We have a lot going on, and I think it's going to be a talking point for at least a couple of races, knowing the 2 of them and seeing how they behaved last year. Then, of course, at the front, we obviously see Oscar win this race, Lando come in 2nd, and Charles Leclerc getting that 3rd step after an incredible choice on his tire strategy. Across the board, this was actually a pretty fun race. I think we dealt with a lot of lapped traffic, and I think the safety car restart, unfortunately, thank you to Kimi, gave us a really exciting last couple of laps in this race. So we definitely have some changes moving forward, and it'll be interesting to see how things shake out once we come back from this triple header and head into Canada. That kind of wraps up the race weekend itself. Let's get into your comments, questions, and hot takes. Okay, getting into questions. Your take on why Lando didn't even try to overtake Oscar after the safety car. This is actually an interesting one that I've been talking a lot with just friends that have been at this race. I really feel like with the McLarens this year, whichever McLaren seems to get away first, whether it's Oscar or Lando, if they are able to be in clean air for the majority of the race, it feels like their teammate cannot catch up to them regardless of like how hard they try. It feels like once they are kind of locked in, they have that clean air, the speed is just impossible to catch. And it's tough because I would actually really like to see them race to the wire a lot more often between the 2 of these drivers. There's such a conversation about which one's better, which one has more kind of ceiling in terms of performance, which one really deserves to be champion, and I think it would be interesting to actually get to see them race down to the wire in a way that we really don't get to because of how well the car performs in clean air. So I don't know that Lando didn't try, but also to be fair, I was watching this on track, and so like the gaps that I was seeing felt like they weren't necessarily surmountable in 6 laps. I think at the safety car restart in particular, it was tough because Oscar really did back them up for a long period of time, like to the point that they were kind of really close together. And once he did restart, it was actually right in front of us, and I think he just got a decent restart. I think he kind of planned that reaction time well. Why did everyone's tire strategy feel insane for the first 2/3 of the race? I agree, we did see some really interesting kind of choices that were either good or bad, and it feels like with this race specifically, we saw people make either really big swings, Max taking a 3-stop strategy, for example, Charles Leclerc holding back tires, and also the Williams coming in early, I think ultimately was a bad move for them. It kind of seemed like there wasn't an overall decision made that like lined up and down the grid. A lot of times we do see tire strategies kind of match up across the board, and we didn't really see that this race. And so I'm not sure what exactly caused that difference, but it seemed like there were just a couple of different gambles basically of which way they wanted to go, how things went, and how much risk they were willing to take in their strategy there. And then lastly, why does it seem neither Lewis Hamilton or Charles Leclerc can get around each other on merit or without instructions? Are they equals? I think this is actually an interesting question and kind of what I was touching on when we were going through the race to recap itself. It seems like they're making these decisions to call team orders before we actually know whether or not the other driver could have passed him. And I kind of hope we back up from that. I'd like to see the two of them again get to race in a way that is possible. Obviously, allowing Charles Leclerc to pass Lewis with this pace this weekend was a good move, and the point swing did move Ferrari up significantly in the constructors standings this weekend. They're now sitting P2 in the constructors. And so I think it was the right move, but it also feels like Charles Leclerc would have passed Lewis regardless. And I do think that I would love to see them at least get to battle it out a little bit more, because I also think that's part of what's keeping these drivers and this team kind of not getting comfortable. Lewis needs to get comfortable in this car, needs to get comfortable with this team, and needs to get comfortable calling strategy. And if we continue to see them make these decisions and call team orders, we're not going to see that. So I guess to the point, are they equals? It's kind of hard to tell because we're seeing strategy calls be made before we actually see them race. All right, let's get into hot takes and predictions for the week. I feel like Max is intentionally trying to pull stuff so he can purposefully get suspended. I do think this is funny because he's joked about it so many times, but it's hard. This was a really weird incident, I think. And it was tough because I feel like he knew what the consequences would have been, and it just feels like maybe his temper got away from him, or he was in the middle of arguing and just wasn't paying attention and kind of gunned it. I don't know, but it is kind of a tough situation. We are seeing him put himself in a bad place for these next couple of races. Okay, we have two different predictions that are almost exactly the same. Stroll retires from Aston Martin due to injury. Max triggers the early release and goes to join Newey. I have to say no comment, but ooh, what a take. George had valid reasons to be upset with Max, but think of the children is dumb. And then we also have Max actually will bring his tissues next time. This is very funny to me because I do think that this battle, this kind of newly revived issue that the two of them have with each other is going to be a really big talking point for us moving forward. And lastly, Red Bull and strategy should be blamed for this race, not Max. I do think actually this is a fair point. A 3-stop strategy felt so bold, and also obviously the call to let George pass was the wrong call and it was a strategy mistake. And also I think Max actually raced a really great race outside of the final 6-lap incident. And so it's tough because it is his decision. It was his choice on track to make the wrong decision. But also up until that point, yes, he was kind of battling against wrong strategy calls. And so it's hard because I think Max really has grown a lot until this. And then you see these moments where it feels like he's getting back into that dangerous point. I don't know what the right answer is. It'll be interesting to see how he returns in Canada and to see what his attitude is. Which is to say, if F1 takes a small break after this very intense triple header, I finally get to get back home. And then the next race is going to be in Canada. That will also be an F1 Academy weekend, which will be interesting to see. And Canada typically has pretty bad weather and fun racing. So it'll be interesting to see what we see next week, how these cars perform, and hopefully to me, we actually get some rain because that's always a really interesting way to see how everyone performs. Between now and next week, you can always find me on social media. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube, following me on TikTok and Instagram. And those locations are always the handle at Marissa Kumari, as they've always been. I hope you've enjoyed the race recap on all those social media channels. You get to see a lot of my Barcelona trip, as well as the trip that I did for MotoGP in Silverstone and some other really cool things. A lot of the long form experiences, including off-roading with a Mercedes G-Wagon, will be done on YouTube, so do make sure you're subscribed there. Make sure you're subscribed wherever you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss the next one. And if you want to have a group to actually kind of experience the races with, you can always join our Discord server. You can do that at the link in the episode description down below. Until next time, I've been your host, Marissa Tandon, and I will see you soon.